Yo creo que... Este es la última charla, la última contribución que vamos a tener aquí al simposio. Y bueno, no es más fácil que la que presenté anterior, porque también significa bastante que esté aquí el doctor, profesor Stephen Wroe. Ahora lo escribí porque en la anterior estaba tan nerviosa que se me olvidó todo el discurso que iba a hacer y ahora sé que estoy en las mismas condiciones, así que y lo voy a hacer en inglés después. Afterwards, I will do it in English, so you will know what kind of bad things I'm saying about you. So, Dr. Wroe se formó inicialmente en zoología, en filogenia, en ecología y biogeografía de canguros y marsupiales carnívoros, publicando importantes contribuciones. O sea, para él, Science, Nature, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science son cosas de todos los meses. Algo que a uno le gustaría que pasara. Su interés abarca, sin embargo, tiene un interés muy diverso, porque bueno, Steve es una de las personas en las que trabajos colaborativos tiene realmente un significado real y magno, muy, muy grande. O sea, es una persona que le encanta la colaboración. Él hace absolutamente todos los grupos, dinosaurios, pterosaurios, hasta invertebrados, creo que ha habido dentro de sus buenas publicaciones. Entonces, su interés abarca extinciones, distribución biogeográfica de vertebrados en general, incluyendo reptiles, dinosaurios, placentarios, también mamíferos placentarios. En solo 15 años de carrera, el Dr. Wroe ha publicado más de 70 artículos de alto nivel. Su excelencia ha sido premiada en diversas ocasiones por el Consejo de Investigación Australiano, que es como el CONICET de aquí de Chile, un poco diferente, con un poco más de recursos. y además por la Universidad de New South Wales también, y bueno, otras instituciones. Pero es rankeado a nivel australiano, que es un nivel muy competitivo, dentro de los mejores investigadores de Australia, como con Index H y todas esas cosas. Entonces él sabe cómo publicar eso y cuáles son los temas de interés y llega a resultados muy, muy interesantes. Sus más recientes estudios se han enfocado en análisis biomecánico, de la forma en que lo conocí. Yo llegué a Australia justo después de mi doctorado en Bristol, en Inglaterra, que bueno, fue compartido entre Bristol y Estados Unidos en la Smithsonian. Pero llegué a Australia sin trabajo, más por una corazonada, pensando en que Australia era un lugar precioso con una fauna muy interesante y yo tenía que ir. O sea, y se dio la oportunidad de poder ir a Australia y me contacté con el doctor Stephen Wroe y él estaba recién desarrollando análisis biomecánico, en el cual yo por suerte tenía algún comienzo en 2 dimensiones, pero en el análisis computacional, en simulaciones de postura en dinosaurios. Entonces el doctor Stephen Wroe vio que en algo podía ayudar, inmediatamente me incorporó a su equipo de trabajo, que era muy variado: ingenieros, biólogos, médicos, gente que trabaja en cinemática, en humanos, antropólogos, realmente un ambiente muy, muy enriquecedor. Y entonces tenemos el honor ahora de tener al doctor Stephen Wroe aquí en Valdivia, con ganas también de hacer colaboraciones, de ayudar a los estudiantes. Espero que hayan conversado con él y si no, conversen con él durante la cena, está muy abierto. Ahora él habla inglés, por supuesto, pero es el idioma de la ciencia, así que los estudiantes no sean tímidos y acérquense, por último, con señas, algo se logra. Bien, ahora I'll do an abstract, actually, because I've been speaking a little bit too much, but well, it's Friday, yeah, don't worry. So it's amazing to have you here in Valdivia. I think you are one of the persons that can collaborate with different people from different views, medicine, engineering. It's actually the most interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary person that I know in this field. No translation, no whatsoever. No. He's really, amen. We can, of course we have to clarify that. Research. Yeah. So you see, he's nice. So we're going to have a great talk with Stephen Wroe.
Muchas gracias, Karen. Thank you. Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you, especially to Karen. As I'm sure you know, Karen and I have worked together previously. Karen worked with me in Sydney at the University of New South Wales. And I was delighted to be invited here to your beautiful university and this lovely town. And I have to say, I've been really impressed with the quality of the science and the facilities and the university in general. At any rate, I know it's Friday at the end of the day, so I'm not going to go on for too long, and I hope this talk, I haven't actually timed it, but I think it's only going to be about half an hour or so. If I go much longer, you can boo me off, that's fine. Now, it was only after I submitted the abstract to Karen that I realised that the talks were probably going to go for a bit longer than my initial talk. So you might notice that there's been a slight change of plan here in that I have added some additional material because the initial talk probably is only about a 15-minute talk. In the first part of this talk, I'm going to talk about some fairly recent work that we published last year on the microbiomechanics of the Neanderthal hyoid. But then in the second part, I'd just like to beg some indulgence, and I will just quickly go over a range of the projects that we have, my group and I have recently published or are currently in the process of completing. So, whoop, that was quick. So the first part is going to be on microbiomechanics of the Kabara II hyoid bone. And this research was done with a view to hopefully determining whether or not Neanderthals could speak. And here we have a Neanderthal that looks a lot like my dad over here. And in fact, some people do say, with the glasses off, quite a lot like me. When people point that out, I point out, of course, that Neanderthals on average had a considerably larger brain than modern humans. As I said in the second part of the talk, myself and my team at UNE in Armidale have worked and continue to work on a wide variety of organisms, a wide variety of vertebrates, and also even some invertebrates. At any rate, with respect to whether or not Neanderthals could speak, first of all, I'd like to get a couple of definitions up there. The first is, obvious question is, what is speech? And most anthropologists consider speech to be the ability to make the sounds that constitute syllables and words. So speech in itself is not language, and I'm at pains to point out that simply by demonstrating that an animal is capable of making the sounds for language, i.e. speech, does not necessarily mean that they had complex language, although it's an obvious prerequisite. Complex language, on the other hand, is the ability to put those syllables and words together into a format that allows the individual to convey ideas, thoughts, and feelings. Now, surprisingly to some, whether or not Neanderthals or any, for that matter, any other non-modern humans could speak, remains a vexed question in the world of physical anthropology. It's been a debate that has gone on for at least 150 years, if not longer. I wouldn't be surprised if it's going 150 years, still going 150 years from now. Certainly there are a number of paleoanthropologists today who believe that only modern humans, anatomically modern humans such as us, are capable of speech or had complex language. And indeed, there are some who believe that complex language only arose around about 50,000 years ago, long after, in fact, even modern humans had arrived or evolved. Now, of course, fossils in themselves can't confirm whether or not an individual practiced complex language, but we think they can show whether or not an individual was capable of speech. Now, the vocal tract is, of course, largely comprised of soft tissue, but there is one important component which is ossified, and that is the hyoid bone, or the throat bone, if you will. The hyoid is a very interesting bone because it is, among other things, it is the only bone in the body which is not attached to another bone. So the hyoid here is held in place by ligaments, muscles, and muscles which attach to other bones or cartilage. And of course, the hyoid, as you can see, among other things, supports the larynx, the voice box, and anchors the tongue and other muscles which are important with respect to speaking. Unfortunately, the hyoid bone is not often preserved in the fossil record, but there are some, and we've been fortunate enough to gain access to CT or micro CT of one of the best, and certainly the best preserved Neanderthal hyoid bone, and that is the Kibara II hyoid. This is from a pretty much complete Neanderthal skeleton from the Kibara caves in Israel, and it's dated at around about 60,000 years in age. There's other fossil hyoid material from Spain, which has been assigned to Homo heidelbergensis. This is from Atapuerca in Spain. Heidelbergensis is, of course, the taxon or the species that many anthropologists believe was ancestral to both Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans. One hyoid was assigned to Homo erectus, but over the last year or two, it's become clear that that was a false assignment. So this is bogus. There is a hyoid that's almost preserved also, that is almost certainly, this is the Dicker hyoid, and that is almost certainly attributable to Australopithecus afarensis. And this is obviously a much, much older specimen. And in fact, fortunately, just in the last couple of weeks, it's been confirmed that we will have access to CT of this material, which is quite exciting. One thing before I move from this slide that I'd like to point out is that, and this is the Kibara II hyoid, is that the internal geometry, all the pores and spaces within the hyoid are well preserved in this specimen. So you can see that it's certainly not a solid piece of bone. There's a lot of internal geometry here. And it's the presence of this internal geometry is very important with respect to the study that we conducted, because essentially we've applied a reverse engineering approach to ask whether the Kibara II hyoid was used in a similar way to the hyoid of modern humans. Specifically, the question we're asking is, does the mechanical behaviour of the Neanderthals hyoid, or is it the same or is it clearly different? And, oh, hang on. Something strange happening there. Obviously, if the mechanical behaviour is the same, then it is at the very least consistent with the proposal that Neanderthals could speak. The underlying theory here, or the underlying premise, is that the complex internal geometry of bone is the product of the forces that are applied to the bone during the individual's life. So a really important thing to bear in mind here is that bone is a living tissue. Bone remodels, bone changes its geometry, especially its internal geometry, in response to the loads and the forces that are applied to it. And some of the foundation work for this study we conducted we published back in 2012. And here we studied, this study was led by a postdoc of mine, William Parr, a brilliant young guy, an absolute genius in the world of shape analysis. And what we did here is, this is actually an ankle bone, astragalus or tarsus. And I generated the models and Will did everything else. But I generated models that preserved or captured the internal geometry of this ankle bone. And this is actually, previously, this had only really been done once before for a whole bone. That was with a vertebra from a sheep's backbone. And that model took took 60 supercomputers about 4 weeks to solve. We were able to generate and solve this model in a matter of a few days, which obviously makes it a much more repeatable process. Anyway, what we did here is we did some sensitivity analyses, and what we showed, so on this side, we have a model where we've preserved the internal geometry, those spaces, the pores in the bone, and on this side, we've got a more traditional finite element model in which we have just treated the bone as two different types of bone, stiff external cortical bone, and we've just applied what we call a bulk property to all of the internal cancellous or porous bone. So this one is geometrically much more realistic. This is one that follows a more traditional approach. And what we found was that there were big differences in the behaviour of these two models. And we also found that this model made using our new approach was far more realistic. And the results that we got, and here, these are results for stress, von Mises stress in these ankle bones. What we found was this was much more realistic. And of course, it's, we think, far more likely to reveal the actual mechanical behaviour of the bone. So we did basically we applied the same approach to our Neanderthal hyoid, as well as a range of modern human hyoid bones. One thing that we didn't include in this study was a chimpanzee hyoid. Truth be known, the main reason for that was because we couldn't find a chimpanzee hyoid bone that we could get scanned in time. But the simple fact is that the hyoid bone of a chimpanzee is an extremely different shape to the shape of a modern human's, whereas the Neanderthal hyoid bone is very, very similar in terms of external shape to a modern human. Bottom line is there's just no way that this hyoid would be behaving in the same way as a modern human's, or a Neanderthals for that matter. That was our explanation to the reviewers anyway, and it was good enough to get it published. We also had some collaborators in Canada who working in a medical faculty who dissected out the main muscles of the hyoid that were of significance with respect to speech. And we got very good recreation of the origin and attachment sites for the different hyoid muscles, as well as the cross-sectional areas of these muscles, which are important in determining the forces applied. We then scaled our models all to the same size and applied the same loads. Anyway, these these are our results. This is just obviously a image grab. Here we have the Kibara hyoid, and here we have 3 modern hyoids. There's no obvious, certainly at this sort of subjective level, there's no obvious major differences in the behaviour. This is on the outside, of course. What's important is what's happening inside as well. And this, here we have, what we've done here is basically draw a line through the hyoid bone, through the inside of the hyoid bone, and record stresses at multiple points throughout the hyoid. And what we found is that the internally the behaviour of the hyoid in the Neanderthal was also very similar, if not indistinguishable, from that of, or those of, the modern humans. And our mean results for stress were similarly very close. So our conclusion is that basically regarding both the distribution and magnitudes of internal stresses as well as internal stresses in the Neanderthal hyoid bone were essentially indistinguishable from those of modern humans. And just going back to our initial premise, because the internal geometry reflects the loadings to which the bone was subjected in life, we think that this is certainly consistent with the proposal that the Kibara II Neanderthal actually spoke. Now, whether or not it made any sense when he spoke, I don't know, but it made we think the Kibara II Neanderthal made sounds very similar to the sounds that modern humans make. It might have been complete gobbledygook, but we kind of suspect they could probably talk. Certainly, this is, and had language, and that's what we think this is consistent with. Anyway, so now flip away from the hyoid, but I'm still going to talk about Neanderthals. And how are we going for time? I don't want to keep people too long. Anyway, obviously, I'm very interested in Neanderthals because of the family resemblance. And we recently got up, we're fortunate enough to get funding to further investigate questions with respect to Neanderthal morphology. A long-standing question with respect to Neanderthals has been, of course, why do they have such a long face, such a prognathous face? Now, the two standard or common theses or hypotheses are that this long face is either associated with a capacity or a need to generate high bite forces at the anterior or at the front of the jaw, or that the long face is some kind of adaptation to cold weather. So the aim of our study has been, well, firstly, to reconstruct the skulls of well-preserved Neanderthals, as well as some Homo heidelbergensis, and then secondly, to test whether or not the Neanderthal skull is in fact better adapted to resist or take high bite forces at the anterior of the jaw. So at this point, we have yet to finish this study, But we have completed the first important phase, and that has been the virtual reconstruction. And I think that this is an area that many people in paleontology would find of interest. The main approach that we have used, or the backbone of our approach, has been virtual reconstruction using 3D landmarks and a process that we, in the vernacular, call warping. So, as you might notice here, we have a Neanderthal cranium. This is La Ferraci 2, French, as you'll note, Philippe, and you can tell it's French. And it's a lovely, mostly complete specimen, but there is still some important geometry missing here. What we have done is we've placed landmarks and slid and semi-slid landmarks at homologous or geometrically homologous points on a modern human skull, and then we've warped it to fit the Neanderthal. Here we have a modern skull, warp it to the shape of the Neanderthal so that the modern skull fits the existing morphology of the Neanderthal, and we can then use that warp to fill in the missing data or the missing morphology. We can also do other cute things like this, for example, is our suggestion of what a modern human Neanderthal hybrid would look like, because this is warped halfway between the two. There are a lot of other actual interesting applications for this sort of approach. So here's a final, this is an example of the final warp superimposed on the actual Neanderthal cranium here. The original Neanderthal cranium is in red, and you can see that the warp is very tightly fitting that existing morphology of the Neanderthal. And hopefully you can see here, this is a slice through, and you can see the warp is fitting the existing morphology of the Neanderthal very nicely. Well, it'll still need a little bit of tidying up, but basically a day or two's manual labour on that, and we will have a very nice fitting, we think, pretty convincing reconstruction of a Neanderthal. We can then take that surface mesh and we can turn it into an engineering model that we can then apply loads, restrain and apply loads to, and digitally crash test. Basically, we can get it to do what we want. In this instance, we're going to get it to bite. Just quickly, another major project that we're working on at the moment is with respect to the reptile-mammal jaw transition. This is a key event, obviously, in the evolution of ourselves and other mammals, wherein the four bones of the lower jaw of the mandible of reptiles ultimately become one, and we get the angular and quadrate sucked up into our ears. Exactly how that happened in terms of the mechanics has been poorly understood. There's a good deal of 2D beam mechanics and subjective analysis that has been done, but it has not been subjected to much by way of well, at this point, almost nothing by way of 3D computational biomechanics. A colleague of mine actually Emily Rayfield in Bristol, who many of you will know is working on a similar question, although we're looking at different taxa. And we're reconstructing another string to our bow in this analysis, is that we are looking at the way in which this process is echoed or recapitulated in the development of the individual. In fact, the whole reptile-mammal jaw transition was predicted by German morphologists back in the 19th century on the basis of embryology. They didn't have any fossils. They just saw that in development, the mammalian mandible went from having 4 basically reptile bones to ultimately 1, and you can see in development that the articular and quadrate end up in the inner ear. So this is another side to the study that we're doing. My colleague Vera Weisbecker at University of Queensland and a PhD student of ours from Columbia actually has been doing a lot of the hard slog on this embryology. At any rate, the other thing we're doing is applying warping protocols in order to reconstruct the crania as well as the mandibles of a number of important fossil taxa in this key evolutionary event. So very similar to what we were doing with Neanderthal. Here we have a Didelphus. Here we have an early cynodont, or a cynodont, very well known one, Thrinaxodon. We take the Didelphus, we warp it to the shape of the Thrinaxodon, we superimpose it on the fossil, and then we clean it up. And we've got our reconstruction. I might make this the last thing I talk about so everyone can get out, but I had to throw in a South American component, and certainly we've worked on a number of South American taxa, from terror birds right through to my favourite South American, the Thylacismilis. Yeah, that's my Spanish for the day. This is a paper we also published last year. And here we compared basically the bite mechanics of the marsupial or Metatherian saber-tooth with that of the better known saber-toothed tiger or Smilodon fatalis. These are obviously both quite extreme examples of the saber-tooth bow plan or body plan. Interesting to note that the saber-tooth morphology has independently evolved at least 5 times in the history of mammals. But there's no doubt that these two are among the most extreme. Which was the most extreme is a question I hope we can answer. One thing's for sure, just looking at the basic morphology from our CT, the size of the canine and its root are absolutely extraordinary in the Metatherian. The roots of this canine basically almost go into its brain case. And there's not much of a brain there, I've got to say, but it sure had a big canine, and it sure had a huge bite or huge gape, absolutely massive. Anyway, the most popular theory with respect to killing behaviour or biting behaviour, at least with respect to Smilodon, is the canine shear bite hypothesis erected by Ackerston way back in '85. Ackerston argued that what Smilodon did was that at wide gapes, so when the jaws were really wide, its jaw muscles did very little work and did not play a significant role in driving those huge canines into the prey. And at that point, that the neck muscles were actually particularly important. Further, that as the gape closed, the jaw closing muscles became more important and contributed more significantly to the delivery of the bite. So this is something actually we had tested previously in a P&S paper back in 2007 with respect to Smilodon, but we really wanted to look at it with Thylacis smilis. So really what we wanted to do is test whether or not this hypothesis also holds for the South American Thylacis smilis. To do that, we made finite element engineering models for Thylacis, going all over the shop. For Thylacis smilis, Smilodon, and a fairly generalized big cat, the leopard. We reconstructed the neck muscles as well as the jaw muscles. And then we got a range of data out of that. The most obvious thing, straight up, is that both Smilodon and Thylacis smilis have weak jaw muscle-driven bites for their sizes. And Thylacis smilis in particular had a pathetically weak jaw muscle-driven bite. In fact, the sorts of numbers we're getting there aren't much more than the bite force that you would expect from a decent-sized house cat. And considering that this animal is probably at least 80, 90, 100 kilos, that's surprising. These are results for our modelling just of using the jaw muscles. They're adjusted for the size of the animals. And what we found is that stress was relatively high in both of the saber-tooths, but especially high in Thylacis smilis when using the jaw closing muscles. And here we have another set of results looking at stress in these animals when they were biting just using the head depressing or neck muscles. What we found here was more or less the reverse. What we found is that stress was highest in the leopard and lowest in Thylacis smilis. So the take home here is that bite force in Thylacis smilis, when in both the saber-tooths was low, but in Thylacis smilis it was especially low, extremely low. But that Thylacis smilis appears to have been particularly well adapted to use its neck muscles to drive the canines into the prey. Basically, the jaw muscles in Thylacis smilis were pretty much useless for the killing bite. They were obviously just good enough to slice up the meat and swallow the food, but we don't think they could have been of any real value in killing the prey. That must have come from the neck. So bottom line is, we think Thylacis smilis took the whole saber-tooth already extreme killing behaviour to a whole nother level. We don't actually think any other saber-tooth did. So it might have had a very small brain, but there's no doubt it was right out there by itself as the most extreme saber-tooth we think of all time. And of course, saber-tooths are already extreme. It's a very extreme way to make a living. Last thing, Another area that we're looking at the moment is reconstructing the crania of New Zealand's giant extinct birds, the moas. I've sort of put this up here really just to show again the kind of this is a finite element model superimposed here on a slice through the CT data. And what I'm hoping you can see there is just how great our finite element models are, because we've captured a heck of a lot of internal geometry of the bird's cranium in this model, and we think that's very important with respect to getting accurate results from your models. Another really neat thing about this study is that we've actually got mummified muscle tissue from mummified soft tissue in some of the moas that we're working at, and this is giving us obviously giving us much more confidence with respect to our muscle reconstructions for these animals. These are some of our preliminary results. I just stuck that up there because it looks good. We don't really know what it means yet. Gracias. That's and yes, I would just like to strongly emphasize that myself and my team in Armidale are always very keen for collaboration. We particularly like working with South Americans, and we have a history of doing that. And we think we're pretty neat in the areas of virtual reconstruction, finite element analysis, as well as three-dimensional geometric morphometrics. Got about, probably about 12 people in our team at the moment, including lecturers, postdocs, and PhD students, and experts in all of these areas. And the point here is that these approaches can be applied to anything. Frankly, we don't care what it is, as long as we think it's an interesting question. We don't care whether it's a dinosaur, a lizard, a bird, a human, whatever. If you think you've got something that's interesting and you'd be interested in collaborating with us, then we're all ears. And that's our website, and you can have a look at that and send me an email. Thanks very much. Thanks.
I think we're gonna, the questions over there. Alexander.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have one of those annoying double questions.
Oh. Could you ask one and then ask the other one, because I'm getting too old to remember two.
That's okay. The first question is, do you think the middle bone ears got smaller and smaller? Is it because they were getting specialized in hearing, or is it because of the other mechanical changes, the dentary growing bigger and the coronoid process?
Yeah.
So could it be like what's the...
Yeah, it is obviously this is an area that's received intense investigation for decades. What actually was happening there, I'm sorry I didn't really have time to explain it in more detail, but what we think, basically two different and frankly kind of antagonistic selective pressures were operating at the same time. One was to increase the efficiency of hearing, and that was being achieved by reducing those bones, but there was at the same time strong selective pressure to increase the efficiency of the bite itself. And they're actually working at odds, which makes it even more remarkable. But what effectively has almost certainly happened is that through a long transitional phase there, what we see is actually a double jaw joint, wherein you've got the modern mammalian dentary squamosal jaw joint, as well as a reptilian articular quadrate jaw joint. And at the same time, the whole architecture appears to have been changing such that the bite became more efficient, and the loads at the jaw joint were reduced, even though the bite became more, actually became stronger. And this is really about reorganization of musculature as well as the bones. This has been the thesis for a very long time, but no one's really tested it in a thorough manner, and that's basically what we're trying to do.
So that's my second question.
Sí.
Is you
Disculpen, los voy a detener un pequeño break. Las personas que van ahora a ver la colección de Monteverde tienen que salir ahora mismo. Pero me parece que no veo la gente aquí, así que... bueno. Sí.
Can you test if these bones were already working in hearing with your techniques? Say, like from this point on, their inner structure shows stress, I don't know, indicators.
That's an interesting possibility. We'd have to have really well preserved. It is basically thought that the lower jaw was always playing some kind of role in the hearing, and that these bones were helping to conduct vibrations into the ear. But yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. If we've got good enough internal preservation, I hadn't thought of that, but that's, yeah, we might look into it. Thanks.
Thanks.
Another question here with Martin.
Okay. This is a really general question about the method in the end. You are doing a really nice job when you are using high resolution tomographies, but in several cases we don't have access to that kind of stuff. And yeah, you can move the specimens to other countries, and in your own place you don't have the equipment. Do you think 2D models are good enough, or 3D models made in base of pictures, for instance, are good enough for?
Look, of course they are, depending on the question. And I would also point out that most of the modelling and most of the 3D modelling we have done is just based on standard medical CT scanner data. Those Moa skulls, they were just from a pretty much bog standard medical scanner, and most of the CT that you'd be able to get here from medical scanners is going to be of comparable quality. Usually, the big advances with respect to medical CT scanning over the last couple of decades are really all about speed and how quickly the CT can be generated. The image quality really hasn't changed a heck of a lot. So you could have a 20-year-old 4-slice medical scanner, which probably a lot of places in South America would have, and the quality of the scans is basically the same as you're getting from a new generation 128 slice scanner. The difference is the late generation one will do it 10 times faster. So yeah, it's you can definitely do it with most CT that you'd get here. And depending on the question, just surface scans can be very good too, as well as 2D. If it's just a shape-based question and you want to apply 3D geometric morphometrics, which I didn't really talk about much here, all you need is the surface data.
Sí. Enrique.
Stephen, I must start saying that I need to apologize myself because I haven't read your work on the saber tooth. Maybe my question is addressed.
It's okay, nor is my mother.
Okay. So that saves me. Well, do your results on the stress and the bite force can give some sustain to the alternative hypothesis that Thylacochilus was a scavenging habits for that kind of animals?
I might be prejudiced here, so I might not be the right person to ask, but I find it really, really difficult to think that it was a scavenger. It's just, scavengers, firstly, typically scavengers actually don't have to have a particularly high bite force. And that's actually one thing that we've shown in some other work, for example, and that is that the spotted hyena, which is often hailed as having the highest bite force of any terrestrial mammal, actually doesn't bite that hard for its size. I mean, it bites hard, but probably no harder than a cat of the same size. What a hyena can do, though, is concentrate all of that force to a single point. And the way, which is what most, if not all, mammalian bone crushers do. And that is, they have teeth with big, bulbous, rounded teeth that allow them to concentrate all the force between two points on two teeth and crack the bone. Because if you want to crack a bone, you don't use a knife, you use a hammer. And by the same token, Thylacochilus, like Smilodon, like modern felids, and all real hypercarnivores, really doesn't have that kind of dentition. So if it was being a scavenger, it's a scavenger that wasn't processing bone, which is kind of weird. And then why would you need the massive teeth? Is another question, unless you want to write it off as a secondary sexual characteristic or something like that. But bottom line is, I don't think that's likely.
Thank you.
Excellent. Darren, last question. Or
So sticking with the Thylacochilus theme, could you determine anything about the possible use of that flange on the underside of the jaw? Did that have any mechanical role that you could see? Or do you think it was maybe...
Yeah, that's an interesting question, yeah. And it's something that our results there did not, didn't look into that. And of course, as you'd know, nimravids and barbarophelids have a similar morphology. And no one's really been able to convincingly or conclusively explain it. We didn't test it there, so I can't say that that study informs on that question in any way, but we'd like to do it. And one thing, I think actually one thing, it may well be, of course, that it's got more than one role. And in Thylacochilus, it's been argued that there were fibrous pads on those flanges that basically were self-sharpening devices. Certainly it's an amazingly sharp tooth, much sharper than in Smilodon and any of the felid saber-tooths that I've looked at. And that might well be part of it, but by the same token, it must have offered some kind of protection to those important but relatively fragile teeth. Another possibility that we were thinking of is that it might actually have used that to rest the jaw, lower jaw on the ground, and then leverage down onto it with the prey's throat in between. And that is something that we certainly could test with this kind of approach. But it's amazing. The teeth are amazingly sharp, as well as being amazingly large. And that also kind of gets back into the bite force side of things, because obviously the sharper the blade, the less force you need to drive it into whatever it is you're going to drive it into. Yeah.
Right. Great. So we should
Go to the pub.
Yeah, go to the pub. Well, we're going to have the dinner.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Big applause.
Thank you, thank you.
We switch to Spanish, but you know the
Muchas
information's
gracias.
already. Bien, no sé si todo el mundo tiene ya su certificado de participación.